visiting poets. So thank you. I love my Bulgarian and Macedonian colleagues, but also the Turks. You know, let's find peace here. And then the other thing I want to say, the other language I've been working on is Sardinian, which has come out of left field and it's in my list to work on. So I've been working on it, and I've fallen in love with Sardinian. I want to go to Sardinia. It's amazing. It's a little island, or a biggish island, just south of Corsica, where Napoleon came from, off the coast of Italy. And it has such an interesting history going back to prehistory. The Nuraghi civilization there was one of the superpowers of the Mediterranean. They were one of the first places where metals were made, and they were exported all over the Mediterranean. And they built these incredible stone towers, which are called Nuraghi, and there are thousands of them all over the island. They were a pleasure-loving and intensely religious people. It's thought they were the first people to invent wine in Europe. They used to use wine and beer and you know, enjoyed life. And it's interesting, fast forward to now, the Sardinians are the longest living people in the world. They on aggregate, they live longer lives, up to their 80s is normal, 90s is very frequent, and hundreds is like quite often. And so why are the Sardinians, why do they have this secret of longevity? Because they love life. They have a nice social life, they're all friends, they have a healthy life outdoors because it's largely a farming and rural, looking after goats type of lifestyle. And they eat a very healthy diet, and they drink very good quality wine in moderation. So anyway, the Sardinian language is fascinating. It's an old descendant of, well, the original Nuraghi language has been lost. We don't know. There's speculation it might have been like Basque, that we don't know because there was no writing, unfortunately. Then the Romans and then the Phoenicians came and sort of semi-conquered the island. And then the Romans came and conquered it. And the Nuraghi people retreated into the mountains, and then it became Romanized. And so Latin was adopted as the language. And it's an early form of Latin. So Sardinian is a Romance language, like French or Portuguese, but it's very closely related to ancient Latin. So linguists love Sardinian, and they've gone there and studied it because it preserves ancient Latin Roman speech patterns. And also some Etruscan words have been contained. So it's fascinating to research all this. And I think Sardinia is really interesting, its historical complexity, because all these different languages and cultures. And I think the project I've associated with this is a very exciting project, and it's to do with creating a global peace intelligence agency. The UN doesn't have an intelligence agency. Its halls are monitored by, CIA, MI6, everybody's listening to everybody else, right? And all these military intelligence agencies, like the aforementioned, the alphabets, Mossad, whatever, KGB, FSB, I mean, none of them can bring peace, because they're all out to get each other. And every nation in the world has one. Some are very effective. The French have two, one dealing with external enemies, one internal. What I'm saying is we need one that is just a peace wisdom agency. So it does kind of espionage, but for the good of the whole of humanity. And people that work for it take an oath of loyalty to all mankind, not to their nation state. And they use non-violence. They use all the joyous arts, but not the death arts, not the war, arts. And I think it should be headquartered in Sardinia, because that's why I put this project with Sardinia.
Are you playing?
Because Sardinia is such a harmless little island. It's never caused trouble to anybody. But it used to be the superpower of the Mediterranean. And they kind of first invented metals, which has caused all this trouble. And they're the longest lived people in the world. along with some Japanese island people. So I think it's a sign for humanity. If we want to live long as a species, let's stick this global intelligence wisdom agency in Sardinia. And it could also function for the EU. We don't have an intelligence agency either, which is why, anybody keeps attacking Europe. But so I think putting it in Sardinia within the EU would be a lovely symbol that, hey, we really do need peace on this planet. And also Mazzini, Mazzini was a great thinker behind Italian nationalism and the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy. He always said he was a real intellectual, Mazzini. He said, a nation state is only a stopping point on the road to humanity. It's not the end goal. Like if you get off at nation statehood, you haven't got to the terminus. The terminus, the goal, is humanity. Victor Hugo knew the same. Einstein did. All the great peace thinkers of all history really have known this. And so that's what this global peace wisdom agency would be doing, or service. And sticking it in Sardinia, I think, would be a lovely gesture. And also, just for anyone that's interested in Marxist theory, you might like to know that Gramsci, who's probably the most intelligent of all the Marxist intellectuals, came from Sardinia. He was Sardinian, and that was his mother tongue. And he then, went to the mainland and got a scholarship to go to university and got involved in the Marxist traditions of northern Italy. But was then, and he always said the struggle for power is not about who owns the factories, not even who's got the most guns. It's who has cultural power. He realised that it's controlling the mind, the ideas, the culture that gives authenticity to the powers that control us. And he challenged that and was arrested by Mussolini and kept in prison for the rest of his life. He was deemed too dangerous. You can't let intellectuals like that out. And also the fact that he was Sardinian didn't help, because Italy's fascist movement hated Sardinians. They hated their independence of thought, and they wanted them to turn them all into good little Italian fascists. And didn't succeed. There was a Sardinian independence movement going on. So for all those reasons, I think to honour Gramsci and to honour the free work of intellectuals above the battlefield of Stalinism and Nazism and fascism and all the Trumpism and all the Putinisms, we need people that will dedicate their lives to humanity as a whole and work for genuine peace. So that's what I've been cooking up this week, and I'm into the home straight now. I'm going to finish this book by Christmas. That's the plan. So I'll let you know as we progress. And just to say that in the study of Sardinian, I remembered this amazing book. I want to recommend this book by Helena Drysdale, Mother Tongues. This is one of my favourite ever books that's ever been written. Helena is a British woman, young British woman, who took her family, her 2 kids and her husband, in a Volkswagen van on a kind of hippie tour of Europe about 20 years ago. And they travelled to all the regions with minority languages which were in danger. She was interested in language and its role in culture and conflict and the rest of it. And she went to Sardinia on as part of the journey, also to the Basque region, to Corsica, up to the Sami lands of Finland, and all the minority languages of Europe. She went physically and describes her experiences. She talked to their intellectuals, their poets and stuff. But it's written like a travel diary. And I'm going to reread the chapter on Sardinia because it's a long time ago since I read it. But yeah, if you haven't read or come across this book, Mother Tongues, Travels Through Tribal Europe by Helena Drysdale, it's a masterpiece. I don't know quite what she's doing these days, but anyway, Helena, hello. Okay, voila. Let's finish and let's move on to our look at our periodic table. This is the planetary tribal map. And by the way, the languages of all these cultures are, you know, in the book that comes with the table or the website. Because obviously sacred languages is part of the whole story. Now, okay, I've got mine. I just did finger on the page.
Well, because it's the birth, not the birthday, the dead day of Platon. Maybe philosophy, Platonism.
Okay, yeah, that's
95.
good. Yeah, sure. Very nice. Okay. Well, that's exciting. So I do them in chronological order. So we'll do him first, I think. It's
What was yours?
a new religious movement. I'll reveal that shortly. So it's a newer thing, you know. Right. So, so yes, as I was saying, I've been, you know, revisiting Platonic thought and writings this week through Iris Murdoch, and our friend that came from Durham University had written some work on Iris Murdoch and her group of. There was a quartet of women philosophers in Britain, apparently, of which she was one, that were very interested in this stuff. And I'm determined to kind of, you know, find out what they were on about. But yes, Plato, he's an extraordinary thinker, and if you haven't read Plato, please do. You know, when I read Plato in my early 20s, I had to leave university to study philosophy because it was so dominated by Wittgenstein academia in Bristol. You couldn't actually do philosophy because every time I tried to talk about philosophy, I was told by very rude people that it was all meaningless because Wittgenstein said so. What? You know, but that was what people were saying in the 70s. So I had to leave there, go to Canada, use the University of Calgary and spend 4 years independently studying away from academia because it was a nightmare. And that's when I read Plato for the first time. And it was like, you know, the most incredible experience of actually sitting down. It's quite an intellectual job to read the whole of Plato. It took me a few months reading every line of the dialogues in English translation. Okay. Although I was beginning to learn a bit of Greek at the time, and later I, you know, learned enough Greek to make sense of the key ideas of Plato in Greek, which is important. But I couldn't work out what this was. Is this humour? Is it wit? There are whole parts of Plato that, is he being ironic? You know, is this like a play he's doing with Socrates as an actor? Is it intended to be like totally deadpan, serious? You never quite know with Plato. Is it just allegory? Does he expect us to take the tale of Atlantis seriously? You know, there are so many questions about Plato's Earth that are still unanswered. We know roughly his intellectual circle. He was from the aristocratic background in Athens. His mother was a friend of Pericles, who was the leader of Athens, the democratic leader. And, you know, he was from a high-level aristocratic background, but he and he wanted to become he wanted to be a dramatist. He wanted to write plays because that was what everyone was doing. To get successful and, glory in Athens, you put on plays like, Euripides or the others, the comedians, Aristophanes and so on, because they were just inventing theatre. So what Plato in effect did was he invented philosophy as theatre. And you have to read the dialogues to understand what I'm talking about. Now, one of my unfinished projects, I used to be a theatre guy. I've written plays, I used to act, I've done Shakespeare, etc. I could have been a professional. I want to see the entire Platonic oeuvre performed for television, in English and maybe in French translation, because Peter Brook, the great dramatist, did it for the Mahabharata. He made an incredible, I think it was a 24-hour production, which was performed in Paris, and it was filmed by the BBC in black and white. He'd pared down the longest poem ever written in human history, the Mahabharata, into a 24-hour play. And it's the most incredible bit of theatre. I want somebody, I'll do it myself if nobody else will, to do the same with Plato's work and pare it down into maybe a series of plays, one-act plays, because the detail is so interesting. The settings, the characters that come and go, some were famous, some were obscure. It would be so interesting to have it performed. And I think Plato would love that. And the fact is, it's never happened. The BBC has never done this. I don't think French television has, to my knowledge. Canal, which they might, do it. And it would be such a nice, like a thank you present to Plato for 2,500 years of philosophical thought for youngsters and oldies. It would bring it alive to the next generations who don't have time to sit down and take 4 months to read really complex books. I did that in the 70s because we still had time. It was before the internet, before Netflix and so on. We could, it was delightful. So that's the first thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say is, of course, he set up the first academy. What his mission was to create a teaching institute, the academy, in the grove outside Athens and the walls. And the reason he did this was his teacher, Socrates, who he revered, had been killed by the Athenian state. Democracy gone mad. The trouble with democracy, I love democracy, don't get me wrong, but the trouble is it can be bought and it can be factionized, it can be weaponized. And rich people then and now can corrupt it. And that's what we've seen, that's how Trump got into power the first time. It's how Putin continuously gets re-elected as the president of Russia because he controls the machinery. And how Modi does it in India. And also it's how Hitler got to power by, democratic means. So Plato's argument was that, okay, fine, that's democracy. But actually you need moral guardians who actually know philosophy and ethics and virtue and will stand watch over the democracy. So he believed that that the best way, where will they come from? Who's going to, because everybody just is running after their self-interest and their own glory and their own faction, and it's like gang warfare in most countries in the world. So what Plato said is, let's have a teaching institution. We'll call it the academy, where the youth can come and learn about philosophy. They can learn about the difference between right and wrong. They can learn about ethics. They can learn how the old myths of religion are teaching stories to bring the soul to its own birth. They can learn about the nature of mind, and they can learn about life after death, and the fact that our lives, which are so short, are not, that's not all there is. And in the back of the Republic, he put the first near-death experience recorded in history. He obviously had intense faith in the afterlife. Because as Kant said, without the survival of the soul, ethics doesn't work. It just is a naked war of competition, of everyone against everyone else. Kant said, no, that's why. If you're going to have ethics, you've got to have some soul that survives and faces judgment or looks at the consequences of its actions. Plato knew that, and that will be one of the core things they'd get in the academy. We should also remember he also had done the mysteries in Eleusis, where people took the equivalent of LSD and literally left their bodies and saw the afterlife for a little glimpse. They came back with absolute certain knowledge of the immortality of the soul. Psychedelic means revealing a soul, right? And Plato had been through that. That's why he was humble enough to know that that knowledge is worth passing on. And whilst doing the mysteries is great, let's have a centre that thinks about it as well and tries to get there without having to take, lots of drugs. One of the characters in the Platonic, Alcibiades, got into trouble because he loved the mysteries so much. He smuggled out some of the potion they used and ran dinner parties in Athens where he'd dish it out, and they were all getting stoned on the equivalent of LSD. And that was not, the direction Plato suggested. He said, no, you don't need to keep doing it, but you do need to think about it. And he believed in prayer and meditation. He lived to a ripe old age. He died in his 80s, finally, having set up this academy, which then endured for nearly 1,000 years. And most of the great minds of the ancient world were taught there or studied. And then it led to offshoots like in Alexandria, the Museum. So there's this wonderful, rich tradition that's at the heart of European philosophy. They call it Neoplatonism, but really it's the same thing. Platonism and Neoplatonism are one continual stream of thinking. And thinkers like Proclus, Porphyry, Plotinus, Ammonius Saccas, who coined the word theosophy, because he said, this is so amazing, we're doing divine wisdom here. Theos, Sophia. And Iamblichus, and, one of the last philosophers of the academy in Athens was called Damascius. Amazing intellectual. I read his books when I was in Scotland. We've got some texts that have come down. He wanted to use logic to prove the Platonic ideal. And they saw logic as an extension of this, and also mathematics. These for them, ethics is a fact-based science, just as much as geometry or algebra. Algebra didn't exist, but they had geometry, and it was the duty of the philosopher to explain all this. So that tradition was amazing, and then sadly, the Christian emperor in Byzantine shut down the academy in Athens. Christians have had trouble, some Christians, some of the time, with intellectuals and with philosophers, and they're going to tolerate them up to a point as long as you don't stray from the script. And there's this is a sad fact that the academy was shut by order of the emperor, but then it survived. It survived underground. It survived because philosophers said, well, that's all right, I'm a Christian. Like Boethius or Erigena, the great Irish philosopher. These people knew their Plato, but they were fine. They were Christians too. And I mean, that's my position. I'm sure if Plato and Christ met, they would have got on like best friends. And that's why in the tradition I come from in Britain, we have a whole Christian Platonic tradition that I believe is precious and worth 1,000 Wittgensteins who are trying to crush all that, deny it, and say it doesn't exist. We also have it in Islam, so there's a Platonic tradition in Islamic thought, which is precious, and Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, these great Islamic thinkers, they loved Plato. They said, well, he's on the side of the angels too. He believes he's a man of faith, like we are. Muhammad probably never heard of Plato. He had no higher education that we know of. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that he wasn't on the same team as Plato. And these great philosophers of the Islamic tradition realised that. And then, of course, it came back in Florence in the Renaissance. And we have this amazing academy was set up again in Florence by the Medicis. And they funded the retranslation of all the Platonic works into Latin. And they hand wrote the books out, which became the hottest selling item in Florence. If you read that book, The Bookseller of Florence, that I finished a few months ago, by a British author who lives near Oxford, it's amazing how they hand wrote these things and illustrated them. And they sold like hotcakes because everybody wanted to read the whole Plato, like I did. You know, until you've read the whole Plato, you haven't got a clue what's going on in philosophy, really. So bless them. And that academy in Athens, in Florence, was like the rebirth of the one in Athens. Pico della Mirandola was one of the people there. Marsilio Ficino was the director of it. And they would have meetings like our philosophy club. Bless them. And then it spread. So that idea, the rebirth of the academy, then came to France. The King Francis I was a great fan of all this and that's why he invited Leonardo da Vinci to come and work here, who had some links to the academy. Amerigo de Vespucci, who discovered America and had his name was given to the discovery, was also connected with the academy in Florence. And I think that would make a marvellous film, exploring the academy in detail and who all these people are then rippled out, like Amerigo or Leonardo and so on. And then, so that Renaissance spread, the French Renaissance, the English Renaissance. And in Britain, John Dee and others knew their Plato. They revered the wisdom that it embodied. And Dee, as a mathematician, also loved the other sort of Neoplatonic mathematicians. One of them, I think it was Iamblichus, wrote a wonderful book called The Theology of Arithmetic, in which he goes into each number in detail, what it means cosmically. They believe numbers are thoughts in the mind of God, and therefore the job of the philosopher is to penetrate what is the thinking in God's mind that produced the number one, for instance. Well, obviously it's about unity, it's about integration, it's about wholeness. Everything I said about him being a knowledge, we have to get back to the one. Well, so that's the core idea. And Iamblichus explains all this. Then he talks about, well, what's the core idea behind number two? Well, that's, okay, it's fun to have one, but it's even more fun sometimes to have two, because you can have a man and a wife, or, you can have love, you can have the other. And twosomeness is fun too. It's a branch of oneness, but it makes itself two-ness. So anyway, I was inspired by Iamblichus's work in my book on religious mathematics, which I published a couple of years ago, 3 volumes, and I updated it. Now that's a very Neoplatonic kind of thing to have done, to look at religious mathematics. I think Plato would have been proud of me. It was great fun to write, and I've still got a 4th volume to do. So anyway, that's I hope the one is tohen in Greek, and the beauty of Plato's thought is that one is good. Evil comes, the trouble with manyness is that it does tend to get chaotic and lead to, like I was saying, all the intelligence agencies spying on each other and not creating peace. It leads to chaos and confusion and darkness. And so, but the one, bringing us back to unity, is bringing us back to peace and to love ultimately, because love is the experience when the manyness gets sight of the oneness again. And yeah, so I think the good, so there's no room in Plato's thought for like an equal force to the good. There isn't a devil figure, there isn't an absolute evil, as in certain forms of Zoroastrianism. if Plato and Zarathustra had met, they would have had differences, and I think I would have agreed with Plato. I think Zoroaster would too. I think he would have said, okay, probably I had the wrong visions, because ultimately the one is good in Plato's mind. And that's why being an academic, which is searching for unity in complex phenomena, is a sacred calling to me and to Plato, because the academic is looking for that goodness within the disparate phenomena revealed by science, and by Plato's greatest disciple or pupil, Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle was a Platonist. This is the secret of thought. If you look at Aristotle's work, he loved the unity too, and the whole of his metaphysics was about how we can find it. So, anyway, there we are. That's enough on Plato. There's more, but you'll have to go into the website and look at the text. And also, I've done a commentary on some of Plato's works, and I'm still working on others. So, wish me a long life. I'll have to move to Sardinia to complete all my work. Any questions about Plato? Did you study him at school or
Yes.
in France?
Yes.
It was part of the baccalaureate.
Yeah, yes.
Good. Yeah, I think they do that less and less now, don't they? And you were saying that they used to study Greek as well in France,
Yes.
yeah? But not anymore so much?
I cannot say, but it's not mandatory. It was not at my time either, but I guess there are fewer and fewer classes in college. No, college is the French for young people in school. Yes.
Yeah. I've always been fascinated when I discovered that Camus was an expert in Neoplatonism.
Uh-huh.
He wrote his thesis, his Agrégations, on Neoplatonism, which people don't realise. We all read Camus back in the 70s and 60s, but he was actually classically trained in Platonic thought, which is why I think I always resonated with him more than Sartre among French intellectuals. There's also another great French intellectual called Pierre Hadot. He was an expert in Platonic thought, and he wrote a book called Meditation in Greek Philosophy, because obviously in the West we all became Buddhists and Hindus and learned yoga and did meditation. What Hadot wanted to know is, did the Greeks do anything like meditation in the Platonic Academy, which had a temple to the Muses in it? If they went in there, did they meditate? And if so, how? He's written a whole 500-page book on this, with quotes from all the great philosophers. And yes, they did. The whole point of Platonic thought was to meditate on the one, if you want, to contemplate it. And that's the philosophical oeuvre which Hadot reveals. And he's one of the greatest French philosophers of our set of, recent decades. Okay, let's move on to the next one. I got Rajneesh, who's number 93. I knew him as a young thinker just starting out my study, as Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, he was called. He later changed his name to Osho, and some people say he was the founder of a new religion. They regarded him as a very, very great teacher. Now that, when I first came across him, he was interesting because he was working on a synthesis of all the religions. He was actually from a Jain background in India, and he knew Acharya Tulsi, who I met, and he was his disciple at a certain point, growing up